For this presentation, Jerry contacted me probably about a year ago offering this program to us, so we're glad that we're able to have him here tonight. It's going to be Trumpeter Swans of Northern Ohio, Jerry Jelinek.
Yes.
In 2023, Jerry was captivated by the first trumpeter swan nest he came upon in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. That initial encounter became a personal project as he documented the 2023 nesting season with still image and videos. Please welcome Jerry.
Thanks. I wanted to, first of all, say you guys have the coolest logo of any Audubon Society I've ever seen. When I saw this on the website, I had to get one of the hats. So hats off to you, quite literally. So tonight what we're going to be doing is a presentation covering the trumpeter swans in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. So my name is Jerry Jelinek, and I am the leader of the photo walks that the Cuyahoga Valley National Park Photo Society does. I also teach macro photography at the Cleveland Photographic Society, and images which I've taken have been used by the National Park for a lot of different publications, advertisements. As a matter of fact, right now we are just beginning our 50th anniversary of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and they chose one of my landscape images as kind of the cover of if you will, of the 50th anniversary. So I feel very fortunate for that. I classify myself as an opportunistic birder. When I come to a event like this with so many accomplished birders, I have to really kind of defer to a lot of you because you have much more experience and much more passion for going out and seeing a whole variety of birds. My passion really over the last 2 years has been with the trumpeter swans, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. What I want to do is hold off all questions until the end of the presentation. I've got about an hour presentation that has about 40 minutes of video included within it. So you'll get to see the cygnets, you'll get to see them flying, you'll get to see the whole nesting cycle of the trumpeter swans. One of the things that people usually try to ask me is where is the location of the nest in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park? And I've been asked by the Natural Resources Department not to disclose that location, to try to keep it somewhat pristine from a lot of people visiting there. And most of the time when I go there, I have the whole marsh along with however many birds are there and other wildlife that's there. So it's a real pleasant place to spend most mornings. But there's other locations here in northern Ohio to see trumpeter swans. Around here is actually one of the best areas. But around the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, we have Kendall Lake. And I actually visited there yesterday. Didn't see any swans, but I've heard reports that there's swans that are there on and off during the non-nesting part of the season. The Beaver Marsh in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park is also a location you can see trumpeter swans. In other parts of northern Ohio, the Bath Nature Preserve actually has nesting swans. That's down in Bath, Ohio. Liberty Park, which is in Streetsboro, has swans visiting periodically in the off-season, in the off-nesting season. Sandy Ridge, much closer to here, out in North Ridgeville. Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge has trumpeter swans. Kilbuck Marsh, which is in Shreve, Ohio, down in southern Ohio, south of Worcester, I should say, they have trumpeter swans. The trumpeter swans are the heaviest living bird native to North America. It's also the largest species of waterfowl with a wingspan of about 7 to 8 feet. So most of us are familiar with how big a Canada goose is. If you take a Canada geese or Canada goose and multiply it by about 2 times, that's about the size of a trumpeter swan. They are large birds. Their typical weight is somewhere between, and for an adult, 20 to 30 pounds. They're one of the heaviest living birds or animals capable of flight in the world. And in terms of average mass, they are the heaviest living flying bird in the world. So we're very fortunate that we get to see these birds here in northern Ohio. The remarkable recovery of trumpeter swans is one of the best successes as far as reintroduction programs that happened. So in the 17th, 18th, into the early 19th century, the trumpeter swans were heavily hunted. They were hunted for game, they were hunted for meat, they were hunted for their soft swan skins, which were used in powder puffs. Their quills were used as writing devices. Feathers were used as decorative hats, women's hats. The trumpeter swan's feathers were very much sought after. And the species is also unusually sensitive to lead poisoning. And that's still a very big problem because you have this history of lead weights being used in fishing. They get into the sediment, and when the trumpeter swans are eating in these low-lying marshes where they live, sometimes they ingest that, and it's usually fatal once they ingest any kind of lead weights. Also, fishing lines, discarded fishing lines are a big problem. They can get hung up in fishing lines. Between 1853 to 1877, the Hudson's Bay Company bought trumpeter swan carcasses from hunters and trappers for part of their commerce, and there was an estimated total during that 24-year period of about 17,700 trumpeter swans were bought by the Hudson Bay Company as part of their commercial activity. By the early 20th century, breeding trumpeter swans were nearly extinct in the United States, with a remnant population of fewer than 70 wild trumpeter swans in remote Hot Springs area near Yellowstone National Park. In 1929, the National Park Service began a survey to determine the population, and by 1932, they had found 31 swans in Yellowstone Park in Wyoming, 26 in Red Rock Lakes in the Centennial Valley of Montana, and 12 others in surrounding areas. So you can imagine the ornithologists at the time really had very little hope of this species being able to recover. Okay, this is the highlight of my presentation, are the videos. So what I've been able to do over the years, over these last 2 seasons, is record in video a lot of the behavior of trumpeter swans. This first video is actually from this year. This is going to be a video that takes place in the early spring around March, where the nesting pair will come into the marsh area and will very aggressively defend that from other trumpeter swans. So what this video is going to show is the marsh itself, and there's a lot of other waterfowl that come through the area. Hooded mergansers here, as you can see, the males are going to be giving some of their mating displays with their head bobs. So there's a lot of other wildlife that's here, especially birds that are in the marsh. Grackles, very common. And here's our resident swans. So they do unison head bobbing in a lot of different manners. This one was part of a territory. So these are interlopers, I'm going to call them. These are the unwanted visitors in the marsh. So what the adults will do, the resident swans will come in and will actually almost attack these interlopers, trying to get them off the marsh. And then what the residents do is they bond back up. They'll do these unison wing flapping. They're making a lot of vocal calls, and they're also doing head bobbing. All this is part of territory displays, and we're going to see this in some other videos. But when they're doing these things in unison, you'll see that. That means that they're a bonded pair. Their vocalizations will be done in unison. Some of these other wing flaps, some of the head bobbing will be done in unison, and that becomes part of the bonding behavior that the trumpeter swans have. Geese are actually a predator to cygnets. There's a lot of predators that cygnets can be susceptible to. So what the male will do of the trumpeter swans is he will actually aggressively go after and shoo all these Canada geese off the marsh. So they want the marsh to be pretty pristine. The wing display is used for a lot of different things. In this particular case, it was used as territory to signal that this is our territory. we don't want you here. It was showing it to these other swans. Okay, this is, the next video here is actually from last year, the 2023. This is May 20th. This was the day that we had hatching of the trumpeter swans from last year. I'm sorry. Trying to get this full screen. I don't know how to do it. I think it was doing it there. So what we're seeing here, this is the nest from last year. That's the pen, which is on top of the nest. And what she is doing is she's doing all the incubation. The cob, the male, won't do any of the incubation. So she's on the nest a lot. It takes about 6 to 7 weeks for the eggs to actually hatch. So this is the cob swimming over to the nest on the day that they hatched. Now, I don't know if this was the first time that he had seen the cygnets from that morning, but you'll see the pen will get up off the nest and you start seeing little heads underneath. So the cob on the left there sees this, and he gives a really nice wing display. I think it's a combination of, it's a territory thing, so he's trying to let anybody who might see it, it's a territory. I also think he might be a proud papa too. So they hatched last year 6, and 3 of those 6 actually survived to fledge. This year's been a very different story, and I'll be getting into that. They hatched 7 this year, and after 3 weeks, there was only 1 that was remaining. This particular marsh has a lot of snapping turtles. That is a real big predator for the trumpeter swans. Okay, this next video coming up is actually the nest from this year. So I've been lucky enough that the swans have been used to me. I've been going there last year in 2023 during the nesting season, and this year about 4 or 5 days a week. So they see me on a regular basis. This year they were much more tolerant of me getting closer to the nest. So this is the nest from this year. It was a little bit deeper into the marsh, but it gave me some opportunity to get closer to the nest. And like I said, the swans were tolerant of me getting close like that. But they are just about the cutest things you'll ever see. So what we see here, that's the cob on the left, giving the territory display. This was actually the day after they hatched. So this is May 24th. Like I said, they're about the cutest thing you can ever imagine. So there's the whole family. There's 6 of them which had hatched. 1 still hadn't hatched yet. But what's kind of fun to see is the cygnets don't have as much muscular control of their bodies yet. So you're going to see them become a little bit on the roly-poly side. Watch this. And then one of the other ones is going to roll down. Now they're so buoyant that if it had rolled into the marsh itself, it would immediately get into a seated position or a swimming position. They're so buoyant, as a matter of fact, they can't put their heads underneath the water for about 3 weeks. So they have to eat by getting the duckweed off the surface, the top surface of the marsh, and when they're done eating, they go back up on the nest, and they form this huddle to rest for a little while and also to do a little bit of preening and just staying warm and looking so darn cute. So like I said, they hatched 7 total, and so you're seeing 6 here. There was still 1 egg in the nest, which then hatched later in the day. But they only spend about 2, maybe 3 days at the nest, because when they're born, they have to be able to feed off the surface of the water immediately. The parents don't feed them at all. The parents will obviously guard them and protect them, but the cygnets have to be feeding on the water. So literally, they only spend a few days at the nest, and then they are out on the marsh quite a bit. This is from last year. This was May 24th. So this was about 3 days after they hatched. That's the cob. There's a lot of fog at this marsh, so you'll see a lot of the videos, because I go there early in the morning, and so there's a lot of videos which have fog in them. So this is the next morning, and this is what they do first thing in the morning. They stayed underneath mom all night to kind of stay warm, and then they're up and about, and they're ready to hit the water almost immediately when they kind of wake up and get stretching. So you see 5 of them there. There's actually the 6th one that's underneath the mother's wings. This is last year's nest. And then I love this one, starts sticking itself up underneath mom's wing here in just a second. So they go down to the water. The cob was down in the water, kind of waiting for them. And as soon as 3 of them went down there, mom was going down there. Now you're going to see the little ones chasing after her, and then a tree swallow comes in and starts taking some of the feathers to move into its own nest. So he was keeping a close eye on them. So as I mentioned, the cygnets can only feed off the surface of the water. So what the parents will do is they actually move their feet underneath the water to kind of stir up maybe insects or some of the vegetation that might be floating up to the surface. And that's how the cygnets are feeding really for about the first 3 weeks. They can only feed off the top surface of the water. You can see they hadn't gone too far, but after about 3 days, the parents, mainly led by the pen, the female, she'll be taking them all over the marsh to explore. So when they're actually building the nest, the pen will build about maybe 4 or 5 different mounds around the marsh. She'll choose one of them as the nest, and then through the summer, those other mounds that she built will act as resting mounds then throughout the summer, because it takes about 4 months before the cygnets fledge. So compare that with your songbirds that fledge in a couple weeks after they're being hatched. These take 4 months. So their biggest time of predation is the first maybe 4 to 6 weeks. That's when they're most vulnerable. And once they get to be about 8 weeks, about 2 months old, then they're pretty much out of the predation portion of it. But now they become more susceptible to human interaction from lead weights, fishing, discarded fishing lines, and things like that. So they're still very much in danger, but they are out of the real critical period once they get to be about 8 weeks old. Okay, protection. This is a big part of what the parents have to do, is protect the little ones. There were some wood ducks there, a lot of wood ducks. So what you're going to see here on the left-hand side, that's the cob. I call this the snapping turtle dance. There's a lot of snapping turtles, and what he'll actually do is get on top of the snapping turtles and start jumping up and down almost. Now, snapping turtles, thankfully, don't see real well, but once they get a hold of something, they do not let go. And what the cob will also do, there was a lone Canada goose. He will try to chase all these geese off of the marsh entirely, because when they're this young, there's so many predators, and the geese would actually go after the cygnets if they could get close enough. And then he comes back and reunites with the pen and with the family. And again, this is part of that territory display, unison display of wings, head bobbing, and vocalization is a really important part. So each bonded pair of trumpeter swans, when they make unison call, it creates a unique sound. that anybody, even the trumpeter swans in the area, can hear for maybe a mile to 2 miles away. They'll know where a bonded pair is because it creates a very unique sound that's unique to that bonded pair. So vocalization is a big part of communication, not only to themselves, but also to other swans that are in the area. You've probably seen in my videos so far, I like wing stretches. And one of the behaviors I found really fascinating is the cygnets, literally as soon as they are hatched, will start doing wing stretches. It's part of building up the muscles in their bodies. So what we're going to see here are actually two of the cygnets are going to be doing a wing display. The one that's in the middle right now does something I call a feather ruffle. It's kind of muted. It's tough to see because they're so small. But the one then on the left, so here comes the feather ruffle, which is right there. And then the one on the left is going to do a more traditional wing display. Everybody loves to see that. But that behavior is instinctive. There's other things which I noticed about them that they kind of learned from their parents, but that wing stretch is something that they do literally as soon as they're hatched. I saw them doing it the very first morning that I saw them being hatched. And the last video of this first section is like a compilation. So what I was doing is creating these compilation videos showing the growth over the month period. So this one's going to be covering from May 20th to June 20th of last year. So you're going to see over this 3-minute video or so from the hatching day all the way up until they're about 1 month old. So you'll be able to see the growth and also the decline in the number of cygnets because they hatched 6, and by the end of this video, they'll be down to 3. It was windy that day that they hatched, but I just couldn't pull myself away. I had, had to stay there. It was kind of a drizzly rain, and I didn't care at all. Just looking at those little ones at the nest is a pretty special thing. And in case you didn't realize, I like wing displays of trumpeter swans. I like wing displays of really any waterfowl, but because the trumpeter swans are so large with that 7 to 8 foot wingspan, it's just fun to watch that. One advantage of going there early in the morning is I get that early morning light, and sometimes with the fog and with this early morning light, it's just really, really beautiful. But when they're this young, they basically are sticking to mom and dad like glue almost. You can see a couple more little wing displays. I can't get enough of that. I've watched these videos, I don't know how many times, I still get a kick out of it. So you can see here, we're down to 4 cygnets already. And this is just a few weeks. They're probably about 2 or 3 weeks old at this point. One morning, she brought the whole family over within about 10 feet of me. And that's how I was able to get these really close-up views of the cygnets. And of course, once you've been swimming around, you got to rest. So this is one of the resting mounds that they had built earlier in the spring. And this particular one that they're using here, they used a lot during the summer last year. So this is a behavior, the bathing behavior. And you'll see the adults will stick their head underneath the water to get some of that duckweed off and maybe some other muck. And you'll see that the cygnets aren't quite used to that yet. They're just about ready to the point where they can put their heads underneath water. But the parents are kind of showing them this is part of the bathing process. This is how you keep your feathers clean. This is how you keep your body clean. And you can see now we're down to 3. And you can see that they've turned gray now once we're about 1 month old. And they will remain that color gray through the rest of the year up until probably about midway when they're about 1.5 years old. Then they start turning white, but they don't mate. They'll bond with another trumpeter, somewhere around year 3, and then about 3 or 4 years is when they can actually mature enough to have their own families. Okay, the population range. What did I do with my notebook? Here it is. It's right in front of me. That's what my problem was. Okay, the current population, or I should say in 2015, it was an estimated 63,000 trumpeter swans in North America. Now, one big thing which happened in the 50s is all that area up by Alaska and the Yukon, that area, they finally discovered literally thousands of trumpeter swans that had been up there, but they didn't know about until they were actually surveyed in the mid-1950s. Now that becomes very important, that area, because we're going to get, here in Ohio, fertilized eggs from Alaska. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So it's an incredible increase. So in 2015, we had 63,000 trumpeter swans estimated. In 1968, there was estimated to be 3,700. So between 1968 to 2015, over that 47-year period, it increased by about 60,000 trumpeter swans. Now, the next major survey is due for next year, for 2015. It'll be interesting to see what the numbers are at that point. The largest populations are obviously up in Alaska, the Yukon, Alberta, British Columbia. There's trumpeter swans are still going to be missing, though, from nearly 2/3 of their original ranges. Now, the reason for that is we've lost marshlands like crazy. It's estimated that somewhere between 90 to 98,000 or 90 to 98% of the low-lying marshlands have been repurposed for other uses. So that's the habitat that they need, but unfortunately we've lost somewhere around 90 to 98% of that habitat. There's 3 flyways for trumpeter swans. There's the interior, which Ohio is located in. You can see it goes up into Ontario, Michigan. It actually goes over to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Arkansas are part of what they call the interior flyway. There's a flyway in the Rocky Mountains where the fly was almost landing, and then it landed, the fly did, over by the Pacific flyway, which is the largest and the most dense areas for trumpeter swans. Okay, the next set of videos is going to cover kind of like the second month, between June 20th to July 20th. One of the behaviors that I found really fascinating is traditionally when they were really, really young, when they just hatched, the pen, the female, would be leading wherever the family would be swimming to. The cygnets would be lined up behind her or hugging her like glue, and then the cob would kind of be in the back, acting as like the protector. As we get to about 4 weeks old, the adult swans will kind of back off and will try to let the cygnets have a little more independence. I call it leading the swim, because that's an important part of getting around the marsh, is swimming from place to place to place. I wish this darn thing would go to a full screen. I don't know how to make it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So that's kind of like the landscape view of what this marshland looks like. Lots of, you can see blue herons, there's green herons which are here, kingfishers are all part of the environment that's in this marsh. But this was basically my mornings, most mornings during the summer and so. So as they get older, they're getting more development into their wings. They're getting a lot bigger. Their feet seem to grow a lot faster than the bodies do, and they get a little bit different look to them. You can see that their bodies are pretty big, but the feathers haven't quite filled out. So here's what I'm talking about. So right now, the cygnets, these two, which were kind of like the dominant cygnets last year, they would lead the swim. The parents would lag behind. That the cygnets were going to do something that they didn't want them to do, then one of the adults would go into the front. But for the most part, they would let the cygnets go to a feeding area or a bathing area, whatever they might want to do, to kind of learn to be more independent. And this next video then is a composite of the June 20th to July 20th aging of the trumpeter swans. So this is them getting up first thing in the morning, doing a little bit of stretching, and then heading out onto the marsh. Lots of duckweed. This marsh is just loaded with duckweed. So there's a lot of wood ducks which are here, a lot of families. I think last year there was one wood duck family. It started out with about 15, and she still had about 10 when they fledged. It was pretty impressive. Tree swallows fledging. That was fun to see one morning. So even if the trumpeters weren't doing something that I was videoing, there were so many other things to see around there. So now they're a little bit older. You can see they're starting to stick their heads underneath the water for the bathing. And they look very much like what their parents do as far as the bathing and the preening cycle. And of course, once they get cleaned up, they go back on and get dirty again on the duckweed. And once you've been swimming for a while, you got to take a rest. Lots of frogs. What's really amazing is I'll see one in the morning, 2 hours later, it's in the same exact spot. It hasn't moved at all. Now this one, you can kind of see that the two adults there kind of have some black. There's an area in the marsh that the vegetation that was underneath the water was in this mucky, brown, slimy stuff. And so, of course, they would get their heads just saturated with that, and then they would have to wash it off. Lots of blue herons, green heron in the background there. There's been an egret that'll visit every now and again, a cormorant. And even here you can see the parents are bathing in the background. The cygnets, though, were kind of going out on their own for a little bit. They won't go far, but just enough for mom and dad to still be able to see them and keep them close. So here the cygnets were kind of leading the hike, and then they decided, nah, we don't want to do it. So I think that's the pen that actually takes over the leadership of the hike. Again, a little bit more of the landscape view of the marsh. Blue herons. Again, when you see that much fog, that's usually first thing in the morning. Sometimes I would get there actually even before sunrise, just to kind of get this behavior when they're kind of waking up, getting loosened up, doing some wind stretches, kind of stretching themselves out. And again, that landscape view, which I like so much. A lot of kingfishers. And once they actually fledge, they are really fun to watch because they'll be doing acrobatics and all chasing each other and stuff like that. So this is the cob, and what he would do most mornings is he would take off and he would do a territory sweep all around the marsh. He would fly around it maybe 2 or 3 times. He'd also go to some adjacent wetland areas just to check on if there was other trumpeter swans that were kind of in the area. So he'd be honking and he'd be flying around. He'd leave anywhere from 15 minutes to maybe 30 minutes, and then he would come back to the family. But he liked to fly a lot. And this is a pretty typical train, if you will, of the swim. So one of the adults is leading the swim, the 3 cygnets will be in the middle, and then the back of the train there will be the other parent. You can see they're starting to get some flight feathers. The flight feathers aren't real big yet, And Dad's going to show them that this is what you're going to get to, but you got to keep working at it. And of course, going over to swim. Actually, what you saw right there was either a frog or it might have even been part of a snapping turtle. Like I said, there are lots of snapping turtles in here. Okay, preening is a big part of any bird's existence. They have to preen their feathers almost constantly to keep them in shape for being able to fly and also to keep themselves dry. So I found it interesting how the cygnets, when they first started preening, it was just very rudimentary, but as they would get older then, their preening capabilities and their techniques improved drastically. You can also see we have beavers, and I found interesting this year, the beavers really don't pose any kind of threat to the swans. One of the resting mounds they had this year was probably 20 feet away from a beaver lodge, and that beaver was there every morning, and neither the beaver showed any interest in the swans, and the swans didn't show much interest in the beaver also. But you can see the flight feathers are coming in now. They still got a long way to go, but they're growing. You can also see how big their tails are, and their bodies are big. Solitary sandpiper. There's also killdeer that'll be here, some of the other shorebirds like that. And here's typical view of the family swimming between point A to point B. Green herons, they're really fun to watch, especially when you get into July and August. They're one of my favorite subjects, other than the trumpeter swans, to watch and capture some video. Look how big their feet are. And the bodies are big, but the wings still aren't filling out the body. But look at the tails, too. Those tails are basically adult size. That's all part of the preening process, is keeping those feathers clean, and also how they keep themselves dry and waterproof. There really isn't oil on the wings, but when the wings are lined up in such a way that they're nice and dense, they become waterproof. So that's also part of the preening process, is making sure all those feathers are properly aligned so they can remain waterproof and so they don't get cold on their bodies. The last video of this section was something that I didn't expect I would have interest in, but once I started thinking about it, I did. So molting is a process that all birds go through. And for waterfowl, there'll be a time where they can't actually fly. That's the cob, and he's going through his molt right now. So his feathers get really raggedy looking. He's not able to fly during this time. So when, oh, hello. Checking us out. Okay. So when they're actually going through the molting process, they can't fly. It takes 4 to 6 weeks. You can see that these are the feathers on the back end of the cob. And you can see the stems of the feathers are there, but the density, the feathers are just kind of deteriorating away. It takes 4 to 6 weeks to go through that molt for a trumpeter swan. So what nature does, it's very clever. When you have a bonded pair that have cygnets, the female will molt maybe June-ish, and then maybe another 4 to 6 weeks later is when the cob will molt. So they always have at least one adult which can fly. So what you're going to see here in just a moment in slow motion is the cob, and then he's going to do a wing stretch, but you're going to be able to get a good view of what the molting feathers actually look like. And you can see little stubs up at the top. That's where the new wing, the new flight feathers are actually coming in. But when it's in this molting stage, it can't fly. So it becomes much more vulnerable. I think that was probably his least favorite part of the summer, was having to go through his molt, because he liked to fly quite a bit. Okay, the trumpeter swans in Ohio. So 2022 marked the first recorded nesting of trumpeter swans in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. In 2023, that's when most of these videos were taken, is the same adult pair, again successfully nested in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And in both years, in 2022 and 2023, they had 3 cygnets fledge. In 2024, as I mentioned, they had 7 and 1 fledged. There's also an event which I'll tell you a little bit more about in just a little bit, that became kind of a negative as far as the nesting season this year. So in Ohio, 1995, there were 0 trumpeter swans in Ohio. They were extinct from Ohio. So Ohio joined other Midwestern states in starting a reintroduction program. And this included the Cleveland Zoo, the Columbus Zoo, and the Wilds. And what they did is they bought fertilized eggs from Alaska, brought them down here and incubated them at the Cleveland Zoo and the Columbus Zoo. And once they hatched and got old enough, they were then put to the wilds, where all these other broods that they were hatching were put together. So this program was so successful that the reintroduction program stopped in 2003. It was only 7 years old, but they were having such good success on bringing trumpeter swans to Ohio that they stopped the reintroduction program. In 2013, the trumpeter swan, which was previously listed as endangered, was moved to being threatened. And the Ohio Department of Natural Resources estimated in 2022 that there were about 863 individual trumpeter swans. And as of 2024, the current ODNR estimate is around 900 trumpeter swans over 26 counties. And the largest concentration, not too far from here, is in the northwest area between Sandusky and Toledo. So count yourself lucky that you've got so many trumpeter swans, and actually tundra swans too, that are up in the northwest area. So on April 8th of 2024, ODNR removed trumpeter swans from the threatened species list. Okay, one more set of videos. Okay, this is the composite then showing the 3-month growth of the trumpeter swans from last year. So this is going between late July to late August. So this is early, I should say early in this video, but it's late August at this point. And then you're going to see fairly soon another wing stretch and showing how much flight feathers then are developing really rapidly with the cygnets. This is a neat slow motion of a green heron fishing. How these things can see fish under all that duckweed is beyond me. But they do. And they're very prevalent during the summer months. So in this particular video, you don't see any adults. So the 3 cygnets actually went out probably about 40, 50 feet away from the parents. The parents were bathing, and they were kind of keeping an eye on them, but those 3 kind of went out on their own. And here we go with the cygnets kind of leading the swim. What was interesting last year, some wood ducks that they showed a little bit of interest in. One of the cygnets last year liked to hang around with the cob, and then here it is right here. Here's the cob, and that's the cygnet that liked to hang around with the cob, while the other 2 cygnets didn't do that nearly as much. They would hang around with the pen more. I don't know why. I'm not sure if it was gender related or if he got better having some dad time together. I'm not sure what it was. But as I mentioned, a lot of wood ducks Had to get a wing stretch in there for the wood ducks. So now, this is getting to be closer to their flight readiness. And take a look at these wings now. So their flight wings are really coming along. This is probably late August or so. So what happens is once they get to the point where they can start flying, which will be somewhere almost to 4 months, 3.5 months to 4 months, during that 2 or 3 week period there, they start doing what I call takeoff practices. Because you've probably seen trumpeter swans, and it takes a lot of real estate. They have to really build up a lot of lift with their wings to be able to take their heavy bodies off of the water. So here's a slow motion of the cygnet's flight wings. Coming along pretty good. So they have to build up the muscles in their legs, in their shoulders, and their wings to be able to generate all that lift. So they start doing that early September or so. But it isn't until maybe about 2 weeks later then they will actually be able to get enough lift to get themselves off the water for short periods of time. And then they just keep building that up and building it up till eventually they can fly with their parents off the marsh and start exploring some of the areas which are around the marsh, some of the other wetland areas. Here's a kingfisher fishing. Always fun to watch the kingfishers. So I keep myself occupied when I'm there. So here's the cygnets feeding underneath the water and getting vegetation. That's one style of feeding. And then this other style I call skimming, is they'll actually just be skimming off the top the duckweed. Now they don't have teeth, but what they'll do is they'll ingest the duckweed along with the water. They discharge the water and they have like a sieve in their mouth. So they can actually filter that duckweed and whatever else might be on the surface of the water, and they just discharge the water back into the marsh. And that's kind of their skimming technique. Now a typical wing stretch is maybe about 4 or 5 bats of the wings. One of these cygnets last year was bound and determined to take off from the ground. And it tried about 40 wing stretches, just beating like crazy. I called it flapper size. And it was flapping like crazy, and it couldn't get airborne. But it was building up its muscles, so there was a good thing associated with that. Now this is the cob. He's gone through his molt, and he was a happy camper, because he could fly again. And boy, for those first few days when he got his flight legs back, or his flight wings back, he was flying as often as he could to get the muscle coordination back. It was fun to watch. Okay, are you ready to see some cygnets try to do some flying? Of course. So I call this the takeoff and liftoff practice. So what we're going to see here are a bunch of Canada geese take off, but we're going to see the trumpeter swans. So you're going to see that they're lined up kind of in the back of the marsh, and fortunately most of these takeoff practices were coming right at me. So I was able to get some nice views of them taking off. They'll be doing that pretty soon. So what we're going to see here, red-tailed hawks are in the area. Obviously when the cygnets are just hatched, these are potentially very, very big predators. There's also bald eagles. Okay, so here they are lined up. There's one of the cygnets which is starting to take off. There's another cygnet starting to take off. There's an adult. There's the third of the cygnets. And you'll see that actually 2 of the cygnets get airborne. This is about a couple weeks after they started these takeoff practices. The adult goes, but then one of the cygnets couldn't quite get enough lift, and it aborts. And what's really unfortunate is you can't hear the audio, but it makes a sound that I'd never heard before. It was a frustration sound like you've never heard. And it was just going, come on, guys. And of course, after you've done a bunch of takeoff practice, you got to take a rest. Okay, this next video then, I'm going to go this direction. This is the swans from last year with what I call the graduation day. So this is exactly 4 months after they hatched. This was September 20th. And the day before, I'm not exaggerating this, the day before there when I was there, I didn't see anything. There was hardly any action going on. And I told them, I said, show me something tomorrow. Well, did they show me something tomorrow? So on September 20th then, the whole family is going to take off. Now what you're going to see is the cygnets are going to lead the flight. The adults are going to follow, but the adults abort the flight. So they come back down to the marsh and the cygnets take off on their own. So here we go. Here's the two cygnets kind of starting. There's one of the adults. Then the other adult, another cygnet which is in the back. They'll kind of catch up here. But you'll see then one of the adults is going to abort the flight. So there's one adult aborting the flight. But the cygnets, you can see two cygnets, they continue flying. So what they did is they had built up enough strength where they could fly for extended periods of time. They started flying around the marsh. And flying around the marsh, and flying around the marsh. They did this about 6 times. And it would take, 30 seconds to a minute each time they were doing this, to fly around. So what ended up happening is one of the adults then kind of gets a little bit, I wouldn't say upset, but it'll go and start flying in an intercepting course from the other direction. So here's our 3 cygnets. And then coming up in just a little bit, you're going to see the 3 cygnets flying from left to right. And very quickly, you'll see one of the adults flying from right to left on the intercept course. It'll be coming up here in just a minute, or a couple seconds here. They are fun to watch fly, because they're so big, and they're much easier than trying to get like a flycatcher. So here's our 3 cygnets, and there's the adult going the other direction. So at this point, the cygnets got the message that they were wanted back down on the marsh. So they come in and do a landing, so you'll be able to see them actually land in this particular video. So they're fun to watch fly, and when they're coming in there, you've probably seen them land. They kind of glide. They use their big feet almost like skis. And there's the adult who was on the intercept course. Okay, I have to give you some background before we do the next video. So this year, that particular video was September 20th. That was about the time that they started leaving the marsh on a regular basis. They would come back, but they weren't there all the time. They would go out for the entire day to other places. So I stopped following them regularly just because they weren't there. And then you got into October and they were hardly ever at the marsh. But this year, toward the end of August, 2 other, I'm going to call them interloper swans, come into the marsh and they will not leave. So the resident pair were trying like the dickens to get these 2 interlopers to leave, and the interlopers would not leave. And eventually, it creates a physical altercation between the interlopers and then also the resident swans. So what you're going to see in this video Okay, there's our residents and the 1 cygnet from this year. That's the resident swans. And what you're going to see in just a second is you're going to see 2 bonded adults flying, and they kept getting closer and closer and closer on their flights to the adults, to the resident pair. The cormorant was visiting for a few weeks this summer. So here are the interlopers, and these were ultra-aggressive swans. I had never seen any swans that were as aggressive as these two are. There's a bald eagle, a young bald eagle. Bald eagle's nest not too far away from this marsh, maybe a couple miles away. So here's the pen of the resident pair going in aggressively after one of the interlopers, trying to get these interlopers to leave the marsh. Because at this point in time, the cygnet is not flying. So the cygnet is still very vulnerable. But the residents were not able to get these interlopers to leave. So what eventually happens then is the interlopers get more and more aggressive. And coming up in just a little bit here, you're going to see, this is again the pen going after one of the interlopers, trying to get them to leave the marsh. And these interlopers would not leave. So what's going to happen in this next clip is the two interlopers are going to fly really close to the cob of the residents, and then the cob goes after, I'm assuming, the cob of the interlopers. So here's the two interlopers, and here's our cob going in for a physical attack. Now they don't have teeth, so they really can't do a whole lot of damage with their teeth, but those wings, they have like an elbow on the joint of their wings where they can do damage. So what happens then is they kind of split up for a quick second. The pen of the resident pair flies in. So all four of the adults are there with this really aggressive wing display, low to the water. And what happens is the two interlopers show the dominant side of saying, this is our marsh. About 3 days later, they had forced the resident pair off the marsh. I wasn't there to actually see that, what happened there, but what's unfortunate is the cygnet then didn't know what happened to the cygnet. Some friends saw it a few days later swimming by itself on one of the waterways that was there in the park. They actually got some video of it flying, so it at least was able to fly, but it wasn't with either of its parents. The cob I found in another marsh close by like a week or so later, and as of 2 weeks ago, it was still there by itself. I have no idea what happened to the pen. So I can't speculate either good or bad, but my guess is something rather catastrophic happened to the pen. Okay, if you're interested in learning more about trumpeter swans, I highly encourage you to check out Trumpeter Swan Society. They're based in Minnesota, and they're kind of the lead arm of reintroducing and educating people on trumpeter swans for North America. Great organization. I'm actually rocking my trumpeter swan vest right now. So I really enjoy their, they have monthly YouTube programs, which are up online. You can see those. I want to thank Gina and Rob for letting me come in there, and thank you for the technical difficulties. We were able to get that going. Thank you to the gentleman. I don't know who it was that we got his laptop to work. Mine was not cooperating with the projector. So I'm going to open the floor up if we want to ask some questions about these trumpeter swans in general. I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty passionate about trumpeter swans, so I know quite a bit about at least the resident pair that's in the national park. Yeah, question in the back.
Were you always on land like the picture there, or did you get waders?
Very good question. Was I on land for most of these videos? The answer is I'm on the edge of the marsh. So literally, I'm down in the marsh. I've got, how many of you have seen these, for turkey hunters, they have these low line, they stand off, their seats are about 6 inches off the ground. And I use that all the time so I can sit there for a few hours and be comfortable, as opposed to sitting in the muck of the marsh for a few hours. But also this year, because the nest was deeper in the marsh, I actually was able to kind of wade through the edge of the marsh, through the cattails and the phragmites and everything else to get close to the nest. And as I mentioned to you, the swans are kind of used to me, so they were kind of tolerant of me being close to the nest. You had a question right here in front.
Yeah, how could you tell the difference between the two pairs?
Very good question. It comes up quite a bit. How do I tell the difference between the cob and the pen?
Well, and the other set.
Okay, the interlopers. The easiest way to tell the difference between bonded pairs is by their vocalizations. They have very distinct vocalizations. Once you start listening to them and seeing the behavior of what they're doing with their heads, they have an ID, if you will, of a audible ID, which you can hear. Visually, when it's springtime and there's a lot more iron in the vegetation, that iron actually stains, especially their heads, when they're feeding underneath the water. So these markings of the iron on their feathers, on their heads, is a way of visually distinguishing the cob from the pen. But once you get into summer and to fall, that iron material isn't nearly as prevalent, and so their heads go and get to be white like this. So this is taken at a public park, and I'm not exaggerating. My car is about 50 feet away from me at this point. There's a pavilion which is about 20 feet behind me. This is in Streetsboro. It's a Liberty Park, and last year, during the fall, there were up to 15 swans there at any given time. It was great. And for this year, because the water level is so much lower, I've only seen them there a few times. They're not there every time. Any other question?
So, do they mate for life?
Good question. Trumpeter swans will mate for life. Now, what's going to happen with the resident pair that has gotten split up this year? I'm assuming, because the cob is still around the area, that it will find another mate. It may take a year or two before they'll bond, but it'll find another mate and hopefully will be able to continue. But the resident or the interloping pair that's at this marsh, they're still there. And they're going to stay there as long as they can eat. So I have a feeling they're ultra aggressive. As I mentioned, I've seen swans, but never as aggressive as these interlopers were. So they're going to be hard to get out of that marsh next spring. Yes, in the back.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I'm Kate Blackman from the Western Reserve Land Conservancy, and I just wanted to mention the important part that Lorain County played in the reintroduction.
Yes, please.
Dr. Wallace Went was the retired veterinarian from the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo, and he was one of the founders of the Firelands Land Conservancy with me. 275 acres in Columbia Station, he actually had fenced off with several ponds with pinioned trumpeter swans that they would lay their eggs, they'd take the eggs, incubate them, and the pinion pair would stay, but the ones that fledged would fly off. And he was part of that with the zoo and the wilds and ODNR
Nice.
back in 95.
That's the first time I've heard that part of the story. I know there's a lot more to the reintroduction program in Ohio than I know of. I'm just giving you kind of like the Reader's Digest version, but I appreciate that much more knowledgeable information about what happened in Lorain County around here. Another question, yes.
Any chance that the interlopers could have been one of their previous cygnets?
That was actually my first thought. The question was, this interloping pair which came into the marsh this year, were they offspring from, say, 2022? And from what I've read and learned about it, it's most likely not, because the offspring will not typically attack their own parents. And so the veracity and the aggressiveness of these two, I'm about 99% certain, have no affiliation with this resident pair that was there. Because like I said, I saw some other trumpeter swans come in, and these interlopers just went after them like it was nobody's business. They were very, very aggressive. And they were going after the cygnet too. When the resident pair was there, they were going after the cygnet. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Are any of these swans banded?
No. That's a good question. In Ohio, I'm not sure if they were banding them back in the 90s, but now that whole, if there was any kind of banding going on, they don't do any of that here in Ohio. Now in Ontario, they do a lot of banding. And there's other areas in the country where they do band them, and they actually have GPS signals too that they'll put on some of them also. You had a question?
I was wondering if these were the swans at Sandy Ridge, or is that a different?
That's a different area, because that's over here in North Royalton, where these swans that I've been photographing are in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. So it's completely different area, completely different swans.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes?
What sort of equipment did you use to make the video?
Just real quick, I was using a digital SLR. Last summer, I was using primarily a Canon 90D with one lens, a Sigma 150 to 600 lens, and that was my primary setup. This year, I actually moved up to a mirrorless camera, the Canon R6 Mark II, with the Canon 100 to 500 lens, which is so much lighter, it's so much sharper than what I was using last year. So, any other questions? Because I know Dale's here getting ready to... Okay. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you again for coming out, and now you get to go home and get nervous about the results. So this was a nice little diversion for the evening. Thank you for your attention.